You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 21st of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, we'll hear an explanation of Vladimir Putin's so-called reliable security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. Plus, it's all lining up. Ukraine readies itself for F-16 jets to finally take to the skies. We'll ask why it's taken so long and what difference it could make in the fight against Russia. Also coming up,
I sought an audience with the President and tendered my resignation as the Secretary of Education effective July 19, 2024.
Why family feuds in the Philippines are causing problems in the country's politics. We'll explore a rare species of cooperation between Washington and Beijing as they try to solve the joint problem of drugs. Plus the papers, we look at the latest theatre news and...
We learned that the North Koreans do, in fairness, put on a pretty spectacular parade, generally inspired by the threat of deportation to the salt pile, which attends any foot out of place.
Andrew Muller brings us up to date. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Donald Trump's presidential campaign has been given a donation of $50 million by one donor the day after he was convicted on 34 charges of falsifying business. Polls in France suggest that Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally is leading the race ahead of parliamentary elections next week. And tributes have been paid to the Canadian actor Donald Sutherland, who's died aged 88. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he wants to build a so-called reliable security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region. He made the comments during a state visit to Vietnam the day after a trip to Pyongyang, in which he and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un signed a mutual defence agreement. Well, joining me now is Jenny Mathers, who's a senior lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. A very warm welcome back. Good morning, Jenny.
Good morning.
So for those of us who don't know, what is reliable security architecture?
I think none of us know, to be perfectly honest, because Putin made this statement, but he hasn't sort of filled it out with any content. So the implication certainly is that reliable security architecture involves less involvement from major Western countries such as the US, Australia, etc., and more involvement from countries like Russia. So it is a direct sort of challenge, really, to the Western-led security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region, but without saying anything terribly specific about what he would offer in its place.
So this would be Russia taking a much more hands-on role in security and defence in that part of the world?
That's certainly the implication. And of course, because it's coming immediately after his trip to North Korea, Putin's statement implies that, the signing of this mutual defense pact with North Korea would play a role in shaping this sort of new security architecture and would be maybe a flavor of things to come.
I mean, it was mentioned last night, or it was reported last night, that Vladimir Putin has said that he would be prepared to supply arms to North Korea. Now, up until this point, we have been under the assumption that it is North Korea which has been helping Russia in its invasion of Ukraine.
Yes, definitely. So it is slightly puzzling, although it may be that Putin is referring to sort of more high-tech military technology, which is an area that he certainly can help North Korea with. But also it might simply be a sort of a tit-for-tat comment because the South Koreans have said that they are now considering supplying weapons to Ukraine, which they previously had not done.
Let's move on a little bit to the way that part of the world has, to the way that Vietnam at least has reacted to Vladimir Putin's visit. I mean, it was a surprise, and we've discussed this on the radio, the fact that Vietnam has been courting many countries. But the fact is that the Vietnamese president had said that Vladimir Putin contributes to peace, stability and development. There is very much that sense now that the world is divided into two narratives.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Vietnam is doing a good job of walking the line between them. It exercises what it calls bamboo diplomacy, which means that it sort of bends and sways rather than breaking and being too rigid. And certainly Vietnam is doing its best to maintain good relations with a wide variety of countries. So it's not putting all of its eggs in one basket, but it is maintaining good ties with Russia. It has these historic links, of course, going back to Soviet times when lots of Vietnamese up-and-coming young people were brought to the Soviet Union for education. And there were these sort of close generational ties between the two elites. So I think, Vietnam is trying to position itself so that it doesn't burn its bridges with the West, but nevertheless enjoys advantages that it can from closer relationships with Russia.
Let's move on to another story which broke yesterday, which is the fact now that F-16 fighter jets will be supplied or are being supplied by Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway to Kyiv. They will finally get that consignment which will help them defend the skies against Russia. Just explain a little bit about what is happening there, because this is a complex system, isn't it, of training, maintenance, supply of the jets themselves. Can you outline what it involves?
So it's been a long time coming. Firstly, there was a long period when the Ukrainians asked for F-16s and Western countries were reluctant to provide them because they were concerned that it would kind of provoke Putin into escalating the war even further in Ukraine. But then once the agreement was made to actually supply them, then, as you say, there needed to be this rather lengthy period of training. And even though it's been quite a long time that the Ukrainian pilots have been training, nevertheless, in comparison to the standard training that a Western pilot would get to fly this plane, it's quite truncated, it's quite short. So that the pilots have to be trained and have opportunities to really get comfortable with this aircraft and what it can do. But also technicians who are going to maintain it and repair it have to be trained. There's a lot of sort of logistics that have to go into the whole process. And the fact that the F-16 requires rather pristine airfields in order to land and take off successfully because of the way that its engines take in air from the ground. So also there's had to be some planning in terms of where they're going to be sort of located. They're clearly going to be targets for Russia. Russia's going to try and destroy as many as possible, as quickly as possible. So there's had to be really a lot of thought about the logistics and the practicalities of getting these aircraft to the Ukrainians and being able to use them effectively.
Just tell us a little bit about what difference this could have made in the last 2.5 years, because it is since day one, Volodymyr Zelensky has said we need to defend our skies.
Absolutely. So I think, the destruction that we've seen Russia wreak on the Ukrainian civilian targets, the infrastructure, the energy infrastructure in particular, has been truly devastating over the entire period of the mass invasion. And, the Ukrainian Air Force has been really limited in what it's been able to do because of the nature of its equipment and the size of it and so on. And the Russians have been able to launch this devastation from well within their borders. So the fact that, the F-16 is able to have a longer range, it's able to carry more sophisticated weapons, it's just a more sophisticated aircraft, means that the Ukrainians should be able to deploy it much more effectively to defend, Ukrainian targets on the ground from Russian attack. But also now that the US and other countries have said, actually, Ukraine can use its weapons that they've supplied to hit targets in Russia itself, this really frees up the Ukrainians much more to use a vehicle like the F-16 to, try and prevent more of this damage, and by hitting targets actually behind the border in Russia before they're able to strike Ukraine.
This combination of being able to use an F-16 in the air, but also to allow American weapons to hit inside Russian territory. How much of a game changer could this be? I think we've seen pictures in the last couple of days of people sunbathing in Kharkiv in the knowledge that, and to the sound of bombs dropping up the road. But the knowledge now is that people can feel for a moment that they can pause and take a breath and perhaps enjoy a moment of life.
That's right. I mean, it could make an enormous difference to people who are, living under the constant threat of attack from Russia. I mean, we've often looked for game changers in this war so far, and I think sadly there isn't going to be an absolute game changer. There's too many moving parts in this conflict, too many different factors, and of course, what we've seen is that Russia does adapt when the Ukrainians introduce new weapon systems or new strategies or tactics. It takes a little bit of time, but then the Russians do adapt. So I don't think it's going to bring a rapid end to the war, unfortunately, but it is almost certainly going to bring a lot of relief to Ukrainians, and it's going to put Russia on the back foot, at least in certain places and for a period of time.
What it will do, though, is that if you have this supply of aircraft from the likes of Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway, you also have the US allowing the use of American weapons to hit Russian territory. The conflict creeps more and more towards a NATO-Russia direct encounter. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, potentially, yes. I think it's interesting to think about what we mean when we talk about, the conflict escalating, because very often what we think of is this sort of a dramatic, sort of apocalyptic escalation where Russia attacks NATO or Russia uses nuclear weapons. But if we think back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, what's happening in the Asia Pacific region, I think that's another form of escalation, which is maybe more likely that, Russia reaches out to other potential partners, upstages, upsettles, destabilizes security relationships in another region. Other actors like the US take steps to try and rebalance that relationship and so on. And so I think escalation has a wide variety of potential sort of forms that it might manifest in. And yes, we may see greater sort of involvement of NATO partner states in the war in Ukraine. But that's not necessarily going to be the way that this war affects security in a wider sense.
Jenny Mathers, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're with The Globalist. It's 14:12 in Manila, 7:12 a.m. here in London. Now, for several years, the upper echelons of power in the Philippines have been dominated by a handful of familiar names, Duterte and Marcos. The two powerful political clans joined forces ahead of the 2022 presidential election and won an overwhelming victory. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won the presidency and made Sara Duterte, the daughter of the outgoing president, his vice president. But now she has resigned from two of her posts, and to tell us more, I'm joined now by Richard Haydarian, academic and columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquiry. A very good morning, or good afternoon, I should say to you, Richard.
Good morning.
It was all going so well for the Dutertes and Marcoses.
Well, not really. I mean, in many ways, this was a slow-motion train wreck because from the very beginning, when both Sara Duterte and Marcos Jr. were contemplating running for the presidency in 2022, so I'm talking about 2021, essentially, there was a lot of tensions between the two. Former President Rodrigo Duterte wanted his own daughter to run as the president. Of course, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was pushing for an alternative. Eventually, Sara Duterte decided to slide down, even though she was leading in a lot of pre-election surveys back in 2021. So they created the so-called Uni team. But that was really just a tactical alliance. As soon as the traditional progressive liberal opposition was sidelined and withdrew from the scene after the emphatic victory of the Duterte-Marcos tandem in 2022, it was really down to the two of them. And just from the very beginning, Marcos Jr. signaled that he's not going to give Duterte everything they wanted. In fact, Marcos Jr. did not give Sara Duterte her preferred cabinet position, which was the defense secretary position. And over the next 6 months, this is the first few months of Marcos Jr.'s administration, a lot of folks close to the Dutertes would be eased out of the government. So it has been really quite some time. And over the past year, tensions between the two major families particularly between Marcos Jr. and former President Rodrigo Duterte, have been really in the out, in a sense that former President Duterte has been attacking Marcos Jr.'s more U.S.-friendly and China-skeptic foreign policy. They have been disagreeing over the war on drugs issue. Marcos Jr. has indicated that he may even be open to investigations, and who knows, even probably the International Criminal Court coming in and issuing warrants of arrest. So tensions have been building up between these two important houses, these two dynasties in the Philippines. And I think Sara Duterte realized she was the boiling frog. It was a matter of time before she was going to be fired or completely sidelined within the cabinet of Marcos Jr. So she decided to resign. That makes her the de facto leader of the opposition led by the Dutertes in the upcoming 2025 midterm elections. So what a turn of events.
It is. That's an enormous amount of number of problems that you've just outlined for us, Richard. Let's talk about Sara Duterte, as you described her, the boiling frog. She has not resigned as vice president, has she? Nor has she given a specific reason why she's gone at this point.
Yeah, she was extremely vague in terms of her public positioning. And interestingly, even though the Dutertes are known for kind of a, let's just be honest, a little bit of pugnacious demeanor, Sara Duterte was very, very diffident, in fact, in her resignation speech. Very similar, eerily similar to former Vice President Leni Robredo, who was also eased out of her office, of the cabinet during the Rodrigo Duterte administration because of disagreements over the drug war issue and human rights issues. Now, Sara Duterte perhaps is still trying to evaluate how she's gonna make her next move. So obviously she's seen as the de facto leader of a Duterte-led opposition in the midterm elections, but she also realizes she is in a vulnerable position. The Dutertes are no longer as powerful as before. Their access to resources won't be there and the administration will have an upper hand here. And guess what? The Dutertes, potentially even Sara Duterte, is going to face investigations over the human rights conduct during her father's time, when she was the mayor of Davao City during her father's time, when there was a lot of human rights violations. Not to mention, there are all sorts of different investigations looking into her conduct when she was in the cabinet of Marcos Jr. and enjoying so-called confidential funds. So she is vulnerable, and that's why I think she's still being calibrated in this somehow clean break that she wants. But I think things are really going to heat up in the coming months as the midterm elections approach.
What does this mean for the stability of Filipino politics?
Well, I mean, to be honest about it, stability is not really the name of the game, especially when Rodrigo Duterte became the president. In many ways, it's really the Dutertes against everyone else, because right now, Marcos Jr. is assembling a new grand coalition that includes many centrist forces. But my understanding is surreptitiously, even elements in the left and elements in the center left, liberals and progressives, are also building their own tactical alliances with Marcos. So it's really Dutertes against the world right now. And in that sense, you could say the major obstacles to stability in the Philippines are really Dutertes. Will they be taken out in the upcoming elections or through the ICC intervention or through other investigations? We don't know. One thing we're sure about is that the Dutertes won't go gently into the night.
Tell us a little bit what it means about the stability of Filipino economics and society, because while the fighting is happening at the top, everybody else has to go about their daily lives.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's not really in fact, as you know, the Philippines is also in the midst of another bigger Cold War. It's not just a Cold War between the Dutertes and Marcoses. It's a Cold War between the United States and China. And the Dutertes are clearly the pro-China camp in the Philippines, while Marcos is very much in the American camp, pushing back against China's aggressive action. So it's really a conundrum for the Philippines. But if you look at the Philippine economy, interestingly, it's very resilient. It's said to be the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia, thanks to robust remittances from abroad, thanks to robust consumer base and growth in the Philippines. So we do have a lot of problems, but so far it looks like this political instability is not really completely derailing the Philippines' economic trajectory. And the Philippines, along with India and Vietnam, is still one of the fastest growing economies on earth. So I think that is what's more surprising rather than the instability that we're seeing in the political scene.
Tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned the Cold War between the United States and China. But the fact was that there's been some really strong escalations of violence between the Philippines and the Chinese Coast Guard in the last week, hasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, the situation is very troubling. There have been at least half a dozen incidents of collisions, water cannons, between the Philippines and China over the past year. But this time it's kind of scary because the Chinese boarded a Filipino vessel staffed with Filipino special naval forces. And had the Filipino forces resisted in an aggressive way, this could have turned out into some melee, if not a kind of an armed confrontation. So gladly the Filipino troops stood down and they were professional enough not to escalate the situation. But my hunch is if this were to happen again, it's not going to turn out as peaceful next time. So now there's a lot of pressure on the United States to come in and make it clear to China that while its mutual defense treaty only applies to armed attacks by China, it may eventually have to intervene if even non-armed attacks by China, meaning hand-to-hand combat, water cannons, lead to some sort of casualty in the Philippines. And in fact, President Marcos Jr. earlier this month in the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore made it very clear that should a Filipino troop or serviceman get killed, whether by water cannon or by actual cannon, that will be crossing a Rubicon. So there's a lot of scramble going on behind the scenes. Having said that, though, many are not necessarily panicking in the Philippines. Their idea is that China is just angry, China is just frustrated, because the Philippines has quietly fortified its position in a number of disputed features, especially in the second Thomas role. The Chinese thought they got the Philippines in the bag. They thought Marcos will be another Duterte. They thought they're going to have their man in Manila. But Marcos Jr. has turned out as far more ferocious and resilient than the Chinese expected. So I think a lot of this is also China just lashing out and throwing tantrums. But having said that, I'm not going to underestimate, of course, the tensions in the ground. It's just that I don't think it's room for panic necessarily, because Philippines has a lot of options. It can use more fast boats. It can use bigger vessels. It can use choppers. And Americans could also get involved, potentially even, sending frigates or drones over the horizon during some of the Philippine patrols. So alarming situation, but I won't still press the panic button.
Richard Haydarian, thank you as ever. Still to come on today's programme, the US and China find common ground, and a check-in from Men's Fashion Week in Paris. Plus,
we learned that the North Koreans do, in fairness, put on a pretty spectacular parade, generally inspired by the threat of deportation to the salt pile, which attends any foot out of place.
Andrew Muller tells us what we learned in the last 7 days. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Vincent McAviney, political journalist and Monocle Radio regular. Good morning, Vinny.
Good morning.
So let's talk about what happened last night on the television. We have a race. We have 2 weeks now until the United Kingdom perhaps, indeed, gets a new government.
Indeed, we'll be waking up, perhaps, as Tony Blair once said, to a new dawn has broken, has it not?
Gosh, the energy that's infused in your voice is so infectious.
I just think we've got to the point now where nothing is shifting these polls. Labour has a sort of solid 22-point lead, barring spectacular accident. I just think we all know the result now.
Here's my fear, or my thought, that actually, have you ever heard about people unleashing their inner bastard when they get into the polling booth? That actually a lot of people and a lot of the press at the moment are all saying even Rishi Sunak could lose his position, he could lose his seat. Yeah. And that's on in the papers this morning.
And he would be the first Prime Minister in history to ever do that. It would be quite a remarkable record.
But the fact that all these warning signs are being sent out to potential Tory voters, that they could get into the ballot box and go, I must stop this. And maybe that the landslide that is expected may not be as quite as convincing as is being thought about.
On the flip of that, I think a lot, and I've spoken to Conservative voters over the last 3 weeks, and I think a lot of them are just not even bothering going to the polls. I think some of them just are a little bit fed up. And just think, they're not sort of swapping their vote to Reform. They're just thinking, I think I'll do a better show by not going and supporting, which is what many people did in 2019 with the Labour Party. Why Jeremy Corbyn's defeat was so bad is that many traditional Labour voters just simply couldn't stomach him. They'd held their nose once in 2017 to vote for him and the party, but they couldn't keep doing that and felt that there had to be a message that he had to go. And so they stayed at home in 2019.
So this all boils down, Vinny, to the coverage that we're going to talk about now about last night's debate on the television, in which they had the leaders standing up and effectively beating seven bells out of each other, and in the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's case, verbally beating seven bells out of a member of the audience.
Yeah, I think Rishi Sunak's tactic of trying to go after a member of the audience is never a good idea. Carlotta, the producer of the show, and I were discussing, Carlotta said, it was like watching Game of Thrones last night, because they were just randomly at points calling out shame, shame, and booing him in the audience.
It did have a
slightly febrile atmosphere last night. I think Rishi Sunak didn't help himself. He was asked a couple of questions where he seemed annoyed and stuff, and also he just didn't have a grasp of the detail. He was asked about this policy, we've talked about it, national service, that he sort of drew from nowhere, compulsory for 18-year-olds to do a year of this, either volunteering at the weekends, even if they have jobs, or doing about 30,000 of them a year doing military service, which the military officials aren't happy with. They don't think it will help them or really work. They'd rather the money to actually recruit people properly. But when he was asked about what the penalties will be in order to enforce the policy, he didn't know. He sort of said, well, they do it in Europe, so we'll look at some of these. He was pressed on this, and he sort of mumbled something about driving licenses and access to finance, which prompted a massive reaction from the audience. The idea that you would block people from banking services seemed extraordinary. Also in this country, if you didn't know already, you can get a driving license at 17. That's when you start to drive. So he's then talking about retrospectively suspending people's licenses. Just extraordinary, which would, then probably affect their employment. It just was extraordinary. He also got into an argument with a member of the audience about the ECHR, and he just came across pretty glib. And she hit back at him after his answer, saying, "Don't put words in my mouth. That's not what I asked you."
Did anyone come out well from this?
I think Keir Starmer did come out well from it. I think the polling afterwards, it looked like he was pretty solid. I think, in terms of the course of this, you would rather do the trajectory that he's doing. The first debate, he seemed a bit unsteady. He was being somewhat too obligatory to the rules when Rishi Sunak was running roughshod and yelling over him and the moderator. And progressively through the debates, he's got better. I thought at the Sky one last week, he was better. And I thought last night, he not only was better, some of the lines he repeated from the Sky one, I don't think there was much of an overlap of audience. It's about message repetition. But I just think he felt more confident. And to be honest, he looked more prime ministerial last night. Rishi Sunak looked like a man with gallows eyes who knows it's up.
What is your reading of the moment of Keir Starmer? Because a most astonishing video has been put out by the Labour Party where he goes for a walk in the Lake District with the former footballer Gary Neville, who is also a staunch Labour supporter. And he gets emotional when he talks about his late parents, and he pulls all the emotional strings. Do you think that's working?
I think it is, and I think he should have done more of it, and he should have done it earlier. You need to craft a narrative, and people, have busy lives, and they need to understand someone, and sometimes the best way to do that, if you're asking for their vote, is to show them your character and reveal yourself and show them where you're from. He is different to the mould of Prime Minister we've had. He didn't go to Oxford. He went to Leeds University, first generation to go to university in his family. He didn't go to a public school. He went to a normal school. That is breaking the current trend in British politics of Oxbridge, of some of them attending private schools. Last Labour Prime Minister to win a majority, Tony Blair, Oxford, and a very private, very fancy school. So it is worth sharing this and not allowing as well the room for Nigel Farage to try and completely own the "I'm an ordinary bloke like you" space, when actually he went to a very posh private school and worked in the city.
OK, let's move on to another story. What else has caught your eye? Do you want to talk about jammed commercial flights and GPSs, or the fact that the New Zealanders are leaving in record numbers?
Have we only got time for one more?
No, we've got time for two.
Oh, we've got time for two. OK, all right. Well, let's talk the GPS one first, because I think this is really alarming. So an incident is reported to have taken place where a commercial transatlantic route for the first time had its GPS jammed. And this is raising fears that thousands of flights are at risk of being deliberately hacked. Now, this was a flight from Madrid to Toronto. Now, it seems likely to have been deliberately targeted rather than accidentally caught in sort of the usual spillover of electronic warfare, because another flight was nearby, a jet that couldn't change its course because it was told that this other commercial jet was out of GPS contact and the timings of the systems were all off. Now, what's really curious in this article by The Telegraph is it seems as if it potentially might not be Russia, although it might be them firing a warning shot that they can do this anywhere and that they can disrupt the West, and this is their sort of nefarious actor shtick at the moment. Or it might be that the volume of media coverage over the fact that they have been running this kind of disruption in Eastern Europe. There was an incident where the British Defence Secretary's plane had its GPS scrambled when he was flying over Poland. It might be that other opportunistic hackers are discovering that these commercial commercial flights aren't that impervious to this kind of attack if you do it. And that spells real concern because they might be sort of someone, just trying to see if they can do it, but not having nefarious intentions. But perhaps there are groups out there who will want to learn the techniques, terrorist groups and such, that might want to try and do this. OK, let's move on to an article in The Guardian about New Zealanders leaving in record numbers. We have always been given the impression that New Zealand is a place you want to move to, not leave. Yeah, I was quite surprised by this story, actually. But I think it does show, we all know that there are long-term effects of the pandemic. New Zealand famously really didn't experience COVID in terms of the sort of disease running roughshod through the population and killing hundreds of thousands of people because it locked away so hard. And maybe this is a slight repercussion of that young people, after being locked in the country for all those years, want to get out and about. But many are leaving because of the economic pressures now, looking to go to Australia. And, here in the UK, there is a huge population of New Zealanders. So it is interesting that for all we, many people here in Britain and in Europe think, oh yeah, New Zealand, great quality of life, and it does frequently rank highly in those metrics, is somewhere that people aren't wanting to go to. Just one other small story from New Zealand, though. I do absolutely love this story. A woman tried to take her long-term boyfriend to a tribunal because he refused to take her to the airport. Now, she was going to catch a flight to go and see a concert. She missed the flight as a result, and she tried to take him to a tribunal. The boyfriend didn't appear, and the case was dismissed. I have a sneaking suspicion that she's a Swiftie. I think this is the Swiftie behaviour.
That's what you're doing tonight, isn't it?
It is what I'm doing tonight. I'm going to the Wembley Eras show. I think she was flying to Australia to see a Swift show, and that's why she's reacted so badly. Any boyfriend who doesn't like an airport is not a boyfriend of mine. Vincent McAviney, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at what we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump's presidential campaign has been given a donation of $50 million. The Conservative billionaire Timothy Mellon reportedly sent the donation the day after Mr. Trump was convicted on 34 charges of falsifying business records in his New York hush money trial. Polls in France suggest Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally is leading the race ahead of parliamentary elections next week. The National Rally appears to be ahead of both the left-wing Popular Front and President Macron's centrists. A warning has been given to athletes from Moldova that they should not compete or perform in Russia. The warning was issued after 6 athletes from the ex-Soviet state took part in the BRICS Games, a sports event for member states of the Economic Grouping of Nations in the central Russian city of Kazan. Tributes have been paid to the Canadian actor Donald Sutherland, who's died at 88. Donald Sutherland had almost 200 credits to his name, including the Hunger Games series and Don't Look Now, in a career spanning more than half a century. And those are the headlines. It's 14:33 in Beijing, 8:33 a.m. in Zurich. Now let's
cover a little bit of breaking news that's being reported on the Reuters news agency website. It says that the United States and China have resumed semi-official nuclear arms talks for the first time in 5 years. Reuters is reporting that the discussions were held in March, with Beijing's representatives telling US counterparts that they wouldn't resort to atomic threats over Taiwan. Well, this news breaks at the same time as a rare moment of cooperation between the US and China, with the two nations holding high-level talks on working together in the fight against drugs. Well, to examine both of these pieces of news, let's hear now from Isabel Hilton, a China expert and visiting professor at King's College London. Good morning, Isabel.
Good morning.
So the details that we're getting are reasonably sketchy about these semi-official nuclear arms talks, but could you just tell us what we know at the moment?
Yes, it's important to understand what these are not. These are not negotiations about arms control, and those have really been hitting a very difficult patch globally, partly because of the approach of Donald Trump to such things. But they are talks about, they're called Track 2 talks, and this is the kind of exchange that goes on below official level, but feeding into official understanding, so that they are a kind of reassurance. And in this case, this is a reassurance about the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan drifting into an atomic exchange. And that has clearly been an anxiety for the United States as they have watched China build up its nuclear arsenal. And I would just add maybe one more concern about the general picture of nuclear armaments in Asia. There have been concerns that Putin's recent visit to North Korea and Putin's intervention in the United Nations in lifting controls over North Korea's development of a nuclear weapon could indicate that there is a kind of quid pro quo in which North Korea supplies Russia with arms and Russia shields North Korea's nuclear development, which began, after all, as a Russian program. Were that to happen, then we might expect a fairly rapid escalation of nuclear developments, including to Japan and South Korea. So there is a certain amount of anxiety about potential nuclear developments in Asia. And I think these Track 2 talks reflect the fact that the big powers need to talk.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to this other story that we want to cover about this moment of cooperation between the US and China when it comes to the fight against drugs. Now, this involves a high-level meeting in the last 24 hours and this has happened very, very briefly, and there is a sign that there is a breakthrough here, isn't there?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, we've got a joint operation which has been revealed, which is connected to traffic and the Sinaloa cartel, which is a Mexican drugs cartel, which plagues the United States through the southern border. And there have been, again, very long-running concerns about a link-up between Chinese gangs, particularly in the traffic of fentanyl, and the Sinaloa cartel. Fentanyl is causing terrible, terrible harm in the United States, as we know. The United States had been hoping that China would restrict the export of the precursor chemicals which are used in the production of fentanyl. Now, that's not exactly what we have here, but what we do have is evidence of cooperation on the kind of ancillary operations, which are to do with the money laundering, the drug-associated money laundering, and the US charging several operators which are connected with this trade. And this is a very promising development. There had been talks on control of drug trafficking, but they had, like other things, been rather knocked sideways by the geopolitical tensions over Taiwan, a whole series of episodes, including, you will remember, the balloon flight over the United States. And these episodes have a knock-on effect on some very useful exchanges. So it's encouraging to see that these exchanges have resumed.
Isabel, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, it's Friday, and it wouldn't be Friday's Globalist without Monocle's contributing editor Andrew Muller giving us his take on the week's news cycle. Here's what we learned.
We learned this week that the trash talking had commenced ahead of next week's apprehensively anticipated first US presidential election debate. We have not as yet learned why this is occurring so early in the campaign, like before either of the contenders have actually even been nominated by their respective parties. And not going to lie, it is tough to rise above the jokes about them trying to get at least the first debate in before the cops come for one participant or the Reaper comes for the other. Hey, all we said was it is tough to rise above those jokes. We merely made them by way of demonstrating that this was what we are rising above. That's not the same as actually making them. Settle down. Anyway, we learned that Donald Trump, at 78, the youthful up-and-coming challenger, was casting doubt upon the mental acuity of the veteran incumbent, 81-year-old Joe Biden.
I think you should take a cognitive test like I did. I took a cognitive test and I aced it. Doc Ronnie Johnson. Does everyone know Ronnie Johnson?
A bold gambit, especially given that we learned when we checked that Donald Trump's doctor's name is, in fact, Ronnie Jackson. Not fewer than 70 million Americans will vote to return the launch codes to him, folks. Sticking with the subject of meetings between unlikely and or unsuitable heads of state, we learned, or at least had it demonstrated to us, that tyranny as a means of government is not notably better at promoting on merit than democracy. We learned that President Vladimir Putin of Russia had decided that 24 years was too long since he had last been to North Korea, or possibly merely reflected that what with one thing and another, he was running short on destinations likely to greet his aircraft with a red carpet rather than an arrest warrant. We learned that the North Koreans do, in fairness, put on a pretty spectacular parade, exultant with the meticulous choreography generally inspired by the threat of deportation to the salt pile which attends any foot out of place. That's what it sounded like. You'll have to imagine Putin and Kim waving through a limousine sunroof. And we learned when Putin pitched up at a gala concert convened in his honour that North Korea remains very much the kind of place where you don't want to be the first guy who stops clapping. Some yards more of that there was. Indeed, they may still be going. But we learned that all this ceremonial flapdoodle had been splendidly well reviewed in the famously rigorously critical Rodong Sinmun, official newspaper of the Workers' Party of Korea, whose view of events will now be read by Monocle's unctuous grovelling desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco.
Passing through the streets of Pyongyang at night, decorated with bright illuminations, the top leaders exchanged the inmost thoughts that had so far been confined to them. And there will too more surely develop the DPRK-Russia relations in conformity with the common desire and intentions of the peoples of the two countries, with their meeting as a momentum.
From which we learned that the language of journalists frantically padding out a word count is indeed universal. And we will once again, Maestro, be requiring the silly French accordion music. For we learned that France is, as ever, gonna France, the latest manifestation of which being the opening of France's first museum dedicated to cheese.
Hooray!
We confess, if we're honest, to being mildly surprised it has taken this long, and are sure that this dereliction has often prompted the sort of outrage we were seeking to caricature when we recorded on a slow afternoon some while back that frankly questionable chorus of Gallic indignation. That's the one. We learned that the imaginatively named Musée du Fromage
What's the point of that?
translates as Museum of Cheese.
I see. Sure, I get it.
Is shortly to adorn the Ile Saint-Louis, that island in the middle of the river which flows through Paris, which allows us, and we checked, to quip that surely the people behind this project are crazy. They're literally insane.
Oh no.
Tough crowd. We learned that a planned plethora of cheese-related exhibits, demonstrations and tastings will be available for €20, but that entry will be free for agriculture students and farmers. So that's an afternoon out next time they all drive phalanxes of tractors to the capital in protest against whatever it is they're protesting against that week. However, we, for one whimsical news monologue, would certainly not wish for the Musée du Fromage to become a target for the violence and vandalism which often attends Parisian civil disobedience, as we would not wish upon the proprietors the grim task of cleaning up debris.
Boo!
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. That was Monocle's contributing editor, Andrew Muller. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time to talk theatre with the theatre critic at the International New York Times, Matt Wolfe, who joins me in the studio. A very good morning to you, Matt.
Good morning to you, Emma.
Fresh off the plane from New York.
Well, just about, almost.
Yes. Before we talk about New York theatre, can we briefly touch on Donald Sutherland? Dying at 88, a huge screen actor and so loved for his performances in the likes of Don't Look Now. But you saw him a couple of times on stage.
Yes, just weirdly, I happen to have seen the two plays that I think he's done in the last 30 years. One was a play on the West End called Enigmatic Variations, which was around 2000, with John Rubinstein at the Savoy, I think it was. And it ran for about 8 or 9 weeks. It wasn't particularly successful, but he was very good in it. And I remember interviewing him during the run. And honestly, Emma, you have not met a sweeter, kinder, gentler, or taller person. And then in New York, off Broadway, he did a play with Giuliana Margulies called 10 Unknowns. And that was rather an unhappy production for various reasons. But again, I remember he just had a sort of effortless command on stage as he did on screen. I mean, to see him in Don't Look Now, Day of the Locust. Anyway,
sadly
he was
missed.
as good as it gets.
He was as good as it gets. Right. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's talk about New York.
Yes.
The Tony Awards were last Sunday.
They were.
What happened?
Well, the results were very equitable. It was as if somebody decided, we're not going to have a clean sweep. We're going to give something to you and you and you and you. So that was quite nice, I think, for the winners, because everyone got their share of the spoils. But there were some notable snubs. The big triumph, I think, is the continual resuscitation of Stephen Sondheim commercially. We all know he was a great artist, died a couple of years ago now, but his stuff has never been commercial catnip. Weirdly, ever since he died, his stuff on Broadway, Into the Woods, Sweeney Todd, have done very well, particularly his latest show on Broadway, Merrily We Roll Along. And this is most remarkable, Emma, because this is a revival of a show that in 1981 closed after 16 performances. I actually saw it in 1981, and I can vouch for the fact that it was an unmitigated disaster 40-odd years ago.
Why?
badly produced, badly directed, and the cast were all kids out of their depths. But 40 years on, we recognize the glories of the score. This production, directed by Maria Friedman, is fantastically well acted, led from the front by its two Tony-winning stars, Jonathan Groff and Daniel Radcliffe.
Who got a Tony.
And both of them richly deserving of their awards. It was, I think, a very sweet win for Dan Radcliffe because he's done 5 shows now on Broadway, and the previous 4 he wasn't even nominated. And I think it was as if Broadway thought, oh, who needs to give Harry Potter an award? You know, he's got plenty else. But I think now they realize, A, he loves Broadway, he's committed to the theater, and he was jolly good in this show.
Plus, he's been on with this production since 2022, so this is commitment, which you don't necessarily see with enormous stars.
That's exactly right. And there was every evidence during the ceremony, and I also saw the production for the 3rd time when I was in New York, the incredible bond between the two of them and their female leading lady, Lindsay Mendez, that these are 3 people for whom when the production ends on July 7th, I think it's going to be a real loss. Can we just say, by the way, that the tickets for the closing performance of this show on July 7th, top tickets, are now going for in excess of $1,200, which they are saying is a Broadway record for a list price, not scalpers, but an actual list price. And for this to be for a legendary Sondheim flop is, I mean, I can't even imagine what Stephen Sondheim would be thinking.
What's happening with Sondheim at the moment? Because I think I read somewhere that they've had an auction of his affairs, and a packet of pencils went for thousands.
And, well, a very good segue. They did indeed have an auction. I, much to my chagrin, missed it by 1 day, or I would have been in there bidding myself. Yes, he was very famous for something from the 40s and 50s known as Blackwing pencils. And there was 3 boxes of them, apparently, and they sold for $6,400, just to pick another sale at random. Several sets of thesauruses, which I would have thought for a wordsmith like Sondheim would have been in great use and great enjoyment. Those sold for about $50,000. The thing about the auction prices, with every single sale was way above expectation. So obviously, again, his value has just gone up exponentially following his death.
Incredible stuff. Right, let's talk about some other stories, other shows that you saw in New York that got you. What did you enjoy?
Well, I particularly liked Mary Jane, which is a play by Amy Herzog that's been seen off-Broadway with Carrie Coon. This time it was on Broadway, marking the, I think, the professional theater debut of the film actress Rachel McAdams. And it's about, it's a 5-character play, all women, about a single mom who has an unseen child. You don't see the child, obviously, during the play. It'd be impossible to act. An unseen young child who is clearly dying. And it's about how this mother copes with the gradual fading away of her beloved son. It possibly sounds very mawkish, but actually it isn't at all.
It doesn't sound like it's not on the list for a fun evening out. Let's put it that way.
What's interesting, you know what the play is about, really, is it's a portrait of goodness, in the case of the mother, and a woman who refuses to be ground down by the bad lot that life deals her. And I think it's interesting on stage or screen. It's easy to play evil, those win awards, those performances, but what Rachel McAdams manages to do is play somebody who has a kind of inner light that won't be extinguished no matter how awful her circumstances, and she does it absolutely beautifully, and I hope she does more theatre.
Briefly, what have we got to look forward to this summer if we're in London or New York?
Well, Kiss Me Kate has just opened at the Barbican, and that looks to be settling in for a run. I'm very excited about Mnemonic, Simon McBurney's brilliant play for Complicité, which is reopening at the National on July 2nd. New York or London, there is no shortage of stuff to keep us busy.
Matt Wolfe, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Finally, today we head to Paris, where Monocle's fashion director Natalie Theodosi is on the ground for Men's Fashion Week. A very good morning to you, Natalie. How's Paris today?
Good morning. It's great. It's a little bit grey, but Beautiful as always, and quite a lot of shows to look forward to today and also over the weekend.
Indeed. Let's begin by looking back at quite an astonishing show in the last couple of days at UNESCO when Pharrell took over for Louis Vuitton.
Exactly. So it's become kind of a tradition for Louis Vuitton to open the week, and they took us to Pont Neuf, they took us to Fondation Louis Vuitton in January, and this time it was the UNESCO building. And as you would imagine, incredible music, a lot. It's one of the biggest collections you will ever see on the runway. And the models also walked outside in the gardens with sort of flags, all the different flags of countries around the world as a backdrop. And I think it was a beautiful message. He wanted to highlight this idea of unity. And you could also see in his collections, it's been exactly a year since he started, that there's signatures and different codes that are now being established. And the collection is doing extremely well commercially as well. You now see those pieces on the streets too.
It was an astonishing show to watch. It absolutely gripped me. And the reason why, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, it seemed to have the most outlandish ideas and thoughts, yet at the same time, almost every single piece was absolutely wearable.
Exactly, and I think that's what Pharrell can do very well. He has quite a commercial acumen. He's his own customer, so he can create a balance between the commercial and the very creative, working with the atelier to also create one-off, like very highly crafted pieces, but also things that people can buy off the rack. So you're right there. I think it's a very intricate balance, and he has achieved it.
That show at UNESCO was about as sort of as big as it could possibly get in terms of flags. You knew that everything had been thrown at it. But tell us a little bit more about how that is fitting with the overall mood across Paris in terms of who people are investing in, where the investments are coming in, and where the money is.
So I think it's important to know that those shows that we see, it's only kind of a small percentage of what really goes on in the city during this week. And if you walk especially around the Marais area, every showroom is filled with brands who are trying to meet buyers, trying to take orders and kind of keep their businesses going. And it's the French brands, but it's also brands all around the world who rent space, and this is sort of how they sustain their businesses. And this year, I mean, we've spoken about Florence and Milan last week being a little bit more than the attendance numbers being lower, but here I think everyone's out in full force and investing in having presence in Paris. So there is a lot of movement. All the buyers are back here. What does seem to be happening is that given the economic situation as well, a lot more of the attention, especially from European and American department stores and retailers, is back on contemporary fashion brands and brands that are offering a slightly better, more accessible price point.
Tell us a little bit more about a couple more of the big brands who are showing this week. The Parisian brands, I think a lot of eyes are on Berluti, not least because they are behind the uniforms for Team France. What are they doing at the moment?
Yeah, so Berluti is under LVMH like Louis Vuitton, but it is a much smaller, quieter brand. So they did a presentation format, but it was really interesting because you got to see the Olympic uniforms, and there was an artisan painting the patina that went on to be featured on the collars that features the colors of the French flag. But then there was also across a series of rooms their next spring-summer 2025 collection. And it starts with shoes is the focus, which has always been their signature. But what's interesting is to see the brand now has really grown and except from accessories, has a full collection, including some of the most beautiful leather jackets and outerwear that I've seen. I think that they're really making leather their signature, and probably it looked like it was one of their strongest collection to date. So I would say the working with the Olympic uniforms gave them kind of a boost of confidence.
Finally, we've got about 30 seconds, I'm afraid, Natalie, to talk about the swan song of Dries van Noten, 66 years old, retiring. Everybody's expected to be there. And he says one day, I think it's the best decision I could have taken by retiring. And he thinks, what have I done as well?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very emotional. It's tomorrow evening in the outskirts of Paris. We got an invitation that just says the word love. And it says that it's going to be in a warehouse, no sign, nothing fancy. And there's going to be a casual dinner followed by the show on Saturday evening. So I think it's a very important moment, one of the greatest designers of our time. And it's really interesting that he is choosing to retire at his peak rather than hold on until kind of the very end, like many other designers too, who can't let go. So I'm really looking forward to experiencing it all.
Natalie Theodosi on the line from Paris. Thank you so much as ever. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. Many thanks to all my guests and to the producers Carlotta Rebello, Chris Chermack and Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London and The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.